The evening of October 15th, 2023, in Chicago promised to be a typical charity event. Fundraising, polite smiles, and the clink of glasses in the luxurious ballroom of the Drake Hotel. Familiar faces flitted among the guests. Businessmen, philanthropists, local celebrities. But in the shadows of the crystal chandeliers, unnoticed by all, stood a man whose simple clothing concealed a secret capable of appending the entire night. No one knew that this unassuming guest in worn jeans and an old sweater was not a random attendee, but a figure whose name would soon make the room hold its breath. Nearby stood James Crawford, a Chicago magnate, certain that this evening would reinforce his status. He had no inkling that his arrogance was about to collide with something greater than himself. Something in this man, his calm, his gaze, hinted at a hidden strength that could shatter illusions and leave a mark on every heart. What would happen when the masks fell? And who would emerge as the true hero of the night? The answer lurked in the shadows, awaiting its moment. The October evening draped Chicago in the crisp embrace of autumn, the city's skyline glowing faintly against the darkening sky. Inside the opulent ballroom of the Drake Hotel, a grand chandeliered space bathed in warm light. A charity gala unfolded with meticulous elegance. Organized to raise funds for children's hospitals, the event drew a crowd of well-heeled attendees, their presence a testament to both generosity and social standing. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, casting prismatic reflections across the polished floors, while round tables adorned with delicate floral centerpieces anchored the room's sophisticated charm. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in flowing evening gowns moved through the space, their laughter and murmurs weaving a tapestry of conviviality. Into this scene stepped Keanu Reeves, a figure so unassuming he might have been mistaken for a late-arriving staff member. Dressed in a plain black sweater, faded jeans that bore the wear of countless days, and scuffed sneakers that whispered of miles traveled, he carried a small shoulder bag that seemed more suited to a backpacker than a gala guest. His appearance stood in stark contrast to the lavish surroundings. Yet he navigated the room with a quiet ease, his steps measured and his posture relaxed, as though the weight of curious glances sliding off him held no significance. He paused near a table, adjusting the strap of his bag, his dark eyes scanning the room not with judgment but with a gentle attentiveness, taking in the swirl of activity around him. Across the ballroom, near a towering arrangement of white lilies, stood James Crawford, a prominent Chicago developer whose name was synonymous with the city's recent architectural boom. Clad in a flawless charcoal suit, the fabric catching the light just so, he exuded the polished confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. A pair of gold cufflinks gleamed at his wrists, matched by the understated luxury of a wristwatch that spoke of wealth without shouting it. His hair, neatly combed, framed a face that carried the faintest lines of a life spent negotiating deals and shaping skylines. As he surveyed the room, his posture was erect, his shoulders squared, a king assessing his court. His gaze swept over the familiar faces, local philanthropists, a few minor celebrities, the usual crowd of Chicago's elite, before landing on Keanu. The sight of the man in his threadbare attire sparked a flicker of disdain across James's features. His brow furrowed slightly, a subtle crease forming as he tilted his head, studying the newcomer with a mixture of incredulity and feigned amusement. To James, this figure seemed an anomaly, a misplaced piece in the otherwise flawless puzzle of the evening. He shifted his weight, resting a hand lightly on the back of a chair, his fingers tapping idly against the wood as he continued to observe. The room buzzed with the soft hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. Yet Keanu remained apart from it all, a still point amid the motion. He slipped his hands into his pockets, his shoulders slumping slightly in a way that suggested comfort rather than insecurity, and moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, where the light was softer and the crowd thinner. James, meanwhile, straightened his tie, a reflexive gesture that underscored his need to maintain an impeccable facade. He turned briefly to a passing waiter, accepting a flute of champagne with a nod, the crystal catching the light as he raised it to his lips. His eyes, however, remained fixed on Keanu, tracking his unhurried progress through the room. The contrast between them was palpable. James, a man sculpted by ambition and adorned with the trappings of success, and Keanu, an enigma wrapped in simplicity, seemingly indifferent to the grandeur that enveloped him. The air carried the faint scent of expensive perfume and fresh flowers, mingling with the warmth of the space. As the evening settled into its rhythm, guests began to cluster in small groups, their voices rising and falling in waves, while the distant sound of a string quartet tuning their instruments hinted at the night's forthcoming entertainment. Keanu found a spot near a window, the glass framing a view of Lake Michigan's dark expanse, its surface shimmering faintly under the city's lights. He stood there, hands clasped loosely behind his back, his silhouette a quiet counterpoint to the glittering spectacle within. James, still rooted near the center of the room, sipped his champagne, the bubbles sharp against his tongue, and narrowed his eyes. Something about Keanu's presence, his refusal to conform, his ease in a space that demanded ostentation, grated against the developer's sensibilities. The gala was only just beginning, and already the seeds of an unspoken tension had taken root, poised to grow in the hours ahead. The charity gala in the Drake Hotel's ballroom transitioned smoothly from mingling to a more structured rhythm as guests began to take their seats, guided by elegant place cards set at each table. The soft clatter of cutlery and the rustle of evening gowns filled the air, blending with the low hum of anticipation. Keanu Reeves, still an unassuming figure in his worn black sweater and faded jeans, found a spot at a table tucked toward the back of the room, where the chandelier's light barely reached. His choice of seat seemed deliberate, a quiet retreat from the spotlight that naturally gravitated toward the center of the ballroom. He settled into his chair, his movements unhurried, his shoulder bag placed carefully at his feet, and his gaze drifted over the room, taking in the scene with a calm curiosity. The table was sparsely occupied, its other guests engaged in their own conversations, leaving Keanu to blend into the background, his presence almost imperceptible amid the gala's grandeur. Nearby, at a table positioned closer to the stage, James Crawford assumed his place with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being seen. His wife, dressed in a sleek emerald gown that caught the light with every movement, sat beside him, her posture poised yet slightly tense, as though attuned to her husband's restless energy. James leaned toward her, his voice low, his eyes darting repeatedly toward Keanu's corner. His expression carried a trace of mockery, his lips curling faintly as he gestured subtly in the direction of the man in the worn attire. His wife nodded absently, her attention split between her husband's commentary and the unfolding event, but James's focus remained fixed, his fingers drumming lightly on the tablecloth, betraying a growing agitation beneath his polished exterior. The evening's program commenced with a welcome address from the organizers, their voices amplified through discreet microphones, calling for attention as they outlined the night's purpose, supporting children's hospitals across Illinois. The room quieted, faces turning toward the stage, but James's gaze lingered elsewhere, his scrutiny of Keanu unrelenting. As the speech concluded, an applause rippled through the crowd. The atmosphere shifted toward the furshit, a lavish spread of appetizers and drinks laid out along one side of the ballroom. Guests rose, their movements a graceful choreography of silk and satin, and the space filled with the renewed buzz of conversation. Keanu joined the flow, his steps slow and deliberate as he approached the buffet table. He picked up a small plate, his selections modest, a few pieces of fruit, a slice of bread, his focus on the food rather than the eyes that occasionally flickered toward him. James, meanwhile, seized the opportunity to act. Clutching a flute of champagne, its bubbles catching the light, he maneuvered through the crowd, his trajectory calculated to intersect with Keanu's position. As he drew near, he slowed, his gaze sweeping over Keanu from head to toe, taking in the scuffed sneakers, the frayed hem of the jeans, the sweater that seemed to belong to a different world. A smirk tugged at the corner of James's mouth, his confidence bolstered by the familiar weight of his own impeccable attire. He positioned himself just behind Keanu, close enough for their proximity to feel deliberate, and as he reached for a canopy, his shoulder brushed against Keanu's with a force that was neither accidental nor aggressive, but unmistakably pointed. The contact was brief, a calculated nudge, and James paused, turning slightly as though surprised by the collision. His expression shifted to one of feigned contrition, his eyes glinting with amusement as he offered a perfunctory gesture of apology, a slight raise of his hand, a tilt of his head, before continuing on his way. Keanu, plate in hand, registered the moment with a subtle glance, his face betraying no hint of irritation or surprise. He adjusted his stance, returning his attention to the buffet, his calm unshaken, as though the encounter had been as inconsequential as a passing breeze. James returned to his table, his stride purposeful, the smirk still lingering as he settled back into his seat. He leaned toward his wife again, his voice hushed but animated, clearly pleased with his small act of assertion. Yet the gesture had not gone unnoticed. A few guests nearby, their attention drawn by the subtle disruption, exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild disapproval. An older woman in a pearl-encrusted gown raised an eyebrow, her lips pursing slightly as she turned back to her companion. A young man at an adjacent table paused mid-sip, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together the interaction. The air around Keanu and James thickened with an unspoken tension, a current that rippled outward, touching those close enough to sense it. Keanu, oblivious or indifferent to the undercurrent, finished filling his plate and returned to his seat, his movements as steady as ever. James, however, sat taller, his chest subtly puffed, as though the encounter had reaffirmed his place in the hierarchy of the room. The gala continued, the music swelling softly in the background. But the brief moment at the buffet table had set something in motion, a quiet friction that hung in the space between the two men, unnoticed by most, but potent in its potential. The charity gala in the Drake Hotel's ballroom flowed seamlessly into its next phase, the atmosphere softening as the notes of a live string quartet filled the air with a gentle melody. The polished wooden floor, cleared of tables at the room's center, became a stage for guests who drifted into pairs, their movements graceful under the shimmering light of the chandeliers. The swirl of evening gowns and the subtle sway of tuxedoed figures painted a picture of elegance, the music weaving a thread of harmony through the crowd. Keanu Reeves remained at his table near the back, his posture relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the edge of his chair as he watched the dancers with a quiet interest. His black sweater and faded jeans stood out against the sea of formal attire, yet he seemed at ease, his presence a subtle counterpoint to the room's opulence. The energy shifted when the master of ceremonies, a wiry man in a crisp suit, stepped to the microphone, his voice cutting through the music with a warm, practiced tone. He introduced a special guest whose support had bolstered the evening's cause, pausing for effect before announcing the name, Keanu Reeves. A ripple of recognition moved through the ballroom, heads turning, whispers rising like a soft tide. A scattering of applause followed, polite but genuine, as Keanu rose from his seat. He offered a modest wave, his hand lifting briefly before dropping back to his side, his expression calm and unassuming. The attention seemed to slide off him as he returned to his chair, settling back into the shadows of his corner with the same understated grace he'd carried all evening. Across the room, James Crawford froze mid-motion, his champagne flute hovering near his lips. The name hit him like a sudden gust, his fingers tightening around the delicate stem as color drained from his face. His eyes widened, darting toward Keanu's table, then back to his wife, whose gaze had already shifted to him, her brow creased with a silent reprimand. Her emerald gown shimmered faintly as she adjusted her posture, her lips pressing into a thin line that conveyed more than words ever could. James forced a smile, the corners of his mouth twitching upward in a strained effort to mask his shock. He set his glass down with a careful precision, The clink against the table barely audible over the resumed hum of the quartet, and ran a hand through his hair, smoothing it as though it might steady his unraveling composure. The revelation lingered in the air, a quiet seismic shift that altered the evening's undercurrent. Keanu, seemingly oblivious to the stir, leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, his attention drifting to the dancers once more. James, however, felt the weight of the moment pressing against his chest, his earlier confidence now a fragile shell. Unwilling to let the moment pass without reclaiming some measure of control, he rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, and crossed the room toward Keanu's table. His charcoal suit caught the light as he moved, his gold cufflinks glinting with each step, a silent declaration of his status. He stopped a few feet from Keanu, who looked up from his seat, his dark eyes meeting James's with a steady, unreadable calm. James stood there, his stance rigid, his hands clasped behind his back as though preparing for a confrontation. His initial approach carried an air of justification, his shoulders squared as he sought to explain away his earlier behavior, his posture suggesting he'd merely misjudged an unknown face in the crowd. Yet beneath the surface, his demeanor remained laced with an arrogance that refused to fully retreat, his chin tilting upward as he lingered over Keanu, assessing him anew. Keanu shifted slightly in his chair, his hands resting on the table's edge, his expression unchanged as he met James's gaze. His response came in the form of a measured stillness, his body language conveying a quiet strength that needed no embellishment. The exchange escalated as James's tone sharpened, his voice rising above the music's soft strains, cutting through the ballroom's ambience. He gestured with one hand, the motion abrupt, as he dismissed Keanu's simplicity, his words carrying a sting of condescension that hinted at wounded pride. Keanu remained seated, his elbows now resting lightly on the table, his head tilting as though considering the man before him. His reply was delivered with the same even keel, his hands opening slightly in a gesture of openness, his eyes steady as he pointed towards something deeper, values that transcended the evening's veneer of wealth. The sentiment struck a nerve, and James's face flushed, his jaw tightening as he took a step closer. His voice climbed higher, sharp and unrestrained, slicing through the room as he accused Keanu of posturing, of cloaking himself in false humility while basking in the gala's glow. The accusation hung heavy, drawing every eye in the vicinity. The dancers faltered mid-step, their rhythm disrupted, and the quartet's music seemed to fade into a distant echo. Guests turned in their seats, their faces a mix of surprise and discomfort, as an awkward silence settled over the ballroom. James stood there, his chest heaving slightly, his hands clenched at his sides, the weight of his outburst reverberating in the stillness. Keanu leaned back, his hands dropping to his lap, his gaze unwavering but gentle, as though the storm breaking around him was merely a passing cloud. The tension pulsed, a live wire threading through the crowd, leaving the room suspended in a moment of raw, unspoken consequence. The atmosphere in the Drake Hotel's ballroom shifted palpably after James Crawford's outburst. The once fluid harmony of the charity gala now fractured by an undercurrent of unease. The string quartet resumed their playing, the notes tentative at first, as though testing the room's willingness to return to its earlier rhythm. Guests who had turned to witness the confrontation gradually averted their eyes, their movements subtle but deliberate, as they refocused on their plates or the dancers who had resumed their swaying, though with less abandon than before. A few lingered on the edges of their seats, their heads tilted toward companions as whispers passed between them, soft and speculative, their glances darting between James and Keanu Reeves. The organizers, stationed near the stage, exchanged quick, worried looks, their hands fidgeting with programs or adjusting their stance, uncertain whether to intervene or let the moment dissipate on its own. Keanu remained seated at his table near the back, his posture unchanged, his hands resting lightly on the table's edge as he watched James with a steady gaze that held neither anger nor judgment, only a patient resolve. His black sweater hung loosely on his frame, the faded jeans and scuffed sneakers grounding him in a simplicity that seemed to anchor the room's chaos. James, standing for a moment longer after his sharp words had spilled out, felt the weight of the silence pressing against him. His chest rose and fell with a shallow breath, his hands unclenching slowly as he registered the lack of support in the faces around him. No one rose to his defense. No approving nods met his gaze. Only the faint rustle of discomfort rippled through the crowd. He lowered himself back into his chair, the motion stiff, his charcoal suit creasing slightly as he settled. The confidence that had defined his presence all evening began to crumble, the edges of his carefully constructed persona fraying under the scrutiny he now perceived. His wife, seated beside him, turned her head away, her emerald gown catching the light as she shifted, her shoulders hunching slightly in a gesture of embarrassment. Her fingers toyed with the stem of her wine glass, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, avoiding the husband whose actions had drawn such unwanted attention. James's hand rested on the table, his gold cufflinks glinting faintly, but the gesture felt hollow, a remnant of a pride that no longer held its former strength. His gaze flickered around the room, catching the subtle disapproval in the faces of those nearby. An older man with a furrowed brow, a woman whose lips pursed as she turned away, a younger couple exchanging a knowing glance. The realization settled over him like a cold shadow, his earlier triumph at the buffet table now a distant memory, overshadowed by the stark reality of his isolation. Meanwhile, a small group of guests approached Keanu's table, their steps tentative but purposeful. A woman in a navy dress, her hair swept into an elegant updo, led the way, followed by a man in a gray suit and a younger volunteer clutching a clipboard. They paused a few feet from Keanu, their expressions warm and appreciative, their hands gesturing lightly as they conveyed their gratitude for his presence at the gala. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, his head tilting as he listened attentively. His responses were marked by a genuine warmth, his hands opening in small, understated gestures, his face softening with a faint smile that carried no trace of arrogance. The interaction unfolded naturally, a quiet exchange that stood in sharp contrast to the tension James had ignited. The group lingered for a moment, their laughter soft and unforced, before dispersing back into the crowd, leaving Keanu to settle back into his chair, his attention returning to the room with the same calm curiosity he'd carried all evening. James watched this from his seat, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The ease with which Keanu engaged, the absence of pretense in his demeanor, gnawed at him, stirring a restless unease in his chest. His fingers tapped against the table, a slow, uneven rhythm, as his mind began to turn inward. He saw himself through the lens of the room, his outburst, his earlier smirk at the buffet, the way he'd positioned himself as above the man, now drawing quiet admiration. The image clashed with the identity he'd cultivated, the successful developer whose name adorned buildings across Chicago, whose wealth and status were armor against doubt. That armor, once impenetrable, now felt brittle, cracks forming as he sat there, the weight of his actions pressing against him. His shoulders slumped slightly, an involuntary surrender to the vulnerability creeping in. For the first time, he felt exposed, not by Keanu's presence, but by the mirror it held up to his own behavior. The ballroom continued its dance around him, the music swelling, the guests resuming their conversations. But James remained still, his gaze drifting to his hands, the gold watch on his wrist a cold reminder of a pride that had begun to falter. Keanu, across the room, sat unbothered, his silhouette a quiet testament to a strength that needed no proclamation, leaving James to wrestle with the unfamiliar sensation of a man undone by his own hand. The charity gala at the Drake Hotel began to wind down, its earlier vibrancy giving way to a quieter, more subdued rhythm as the evening neared its close. The auction, a flurry of bids and applause that had briefly rekindled the room's energy, concluded with the final gavel strike, leaving behind a scattering of empty bitter paddles and satisfied smiles. Guests rose from their seats, their movements slow and deliberate, gathering wraps and handbags as they prepared to depart. The string quartet packed away their instruments, the last notes fading into the hum of farewells and the soft clink of glasses being cleared by staff. James Crawford remained at his table, alone now, his wife having stepped away to chat with a departing acquaintance near the ballroom's entrance. He cradled the remnants of his champagne, the flute nearly empty, the bubbles long since flattened into a tepid stillness. His fingers traced the rim absently, his gaze drifting across the room to where Keanu Reeves stood near the back. Keanu, still dressed in his unassuming black sweater and faded jeans, had taken up a task few would have expected. He was helping the organizers stack a handful of chairs left scattered after the crowd thinned. His movements were steady, unhurried, as he lifted each chair with care, aligning them against the wall with a quiet efficiency. His shoulder bag rested on the floor nearby, a modest sentinel to his presence, while his sneakers scuffed softly against the polished wood. The simplicity of the act, Keanu bending slightly, his hands gripping the chair frames, his focus on the task rather than the room, struck James with an unexpected force. It was a gesture so at odds with the evening's polish, so devoid of the posturing James had clung to, that it pierced through the haze of his earlier defensiveness. He leaned back in his chair, the charcoal suit creasing at the elbows, his gold cufflinks catching the dimming light as he watched. The sight churned something deep within him, a restless stirring that clawed at the edges of his conscience. His mind replayed the night, the smirk at the buffet, the sharp words flung in the heat of his pride, the silence that had followed. Each memory landed like a stone, heavy and unyielding, piling atop the realization that his behavior had been not just unnecessary, but fundamentally misaligned with the spirit of the evening. His shoulders tensed, then slumped, as though the weight of that understanding pressed physically against him. The ballroom continued to empty, the rustle of departing guests fading into a distant murmur, leaving James with the space to confront himself. He set the champagne flute down, the glass clinking softly against the table, and ran a hand over his face, his fingers lingering briefly at his temples. His eyes followed Keanu, who now paused to exchange a few words with a volunteer, a young woman in a plain black uniform, her clipboard tucked under her arm. Keanu's posture was open, his head tilted slightly as he listened, his hands gesturing faintly in a way that suggested genuine engagement. The volunteer nodded, her face brightening, before stepping away to resume her duties, leaving Keanu to adjust one final chair. James felt a pang, sharp and unfamiliar, as he watched this quiet exchange. It was a contrast he couldn't ignore. Keanu's ease, his willingness to step into the unglamorous margins of the night, against his own insistence on asserting dominance in a space meant for generosity. The realization settled deeper, and with it came a flicker of resolve. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping faintly against the floor, and stood, his movements slow but purposeful. His hands smoothed the front of his suit, a reflexive gesture that felt less certain than it had hours earlier, and he crossed the room toward Keanu. The distance felt longer than it was, each step a shedding of the bravado that had carried him through the gala. He stopped a few feet from Keanu, who turned from the chairs, his dark eyes meeting James's with a calm curiosity. James hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor, his polished shoes stark against the wood. His shoulders hunched slightly, his hands slipping into his pockets as he gathered himself. When he looked up, his expression had softened, the hard lines of his earlier arrogance replaced by something rawer, more honest. He offered an apology, his head bowing faintly, the gesture encompassing not just the man before him, but the version of himself he'd glimpsed in the night's unraveling. Keanu regarded him for a moment, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his face unchanging save for a slight nod, an acknowledgement that carried no demand for elaboration. He responded with a brief gesture, his hand lifting slightly as though to bridge the space between them, his demeanor steady and unassuming. The exchange was brief, a quiet transaction of recognition and grace, and James stepped back, his chest rising with a slow breath. He turned away, his footsteps heavier now, not with defeat, but with the weight of introspection. As he moved toward the ballroom's edge, his gaze shifted, less guarded, less certain, but tinged with a nascent awareness. The chase for external validation, the relentless pursuit of a status he'd worn like armor, flickered in his mind as something he'd overlooked in himself, a void he hadn't named until now. Keanu returned to his task, lifting his bag from the floor and slinging it over his shoulder, his silhouette receding into the room's softening shadows as James lingered, caught in the quiet dawn of a shift he couldn't yet fully articulate. The charity gala at the Drake Hotel drew to its inevitable close, the once vibrant ballroom emptying as the last of the guests filtered out into the October night. The grand space, so recently alive with music and laughter, grew still, its chandeliers dimming one by one, their lights softening into a faint glow that barely reached the polished floors. Staff moved quietly through the room, stacking chairs and clearing tables, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, while the scent of flowers lingered in the air, mingling with the fading traces of perfume. Outside, the cool Chicago breeze swept through the streets, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves skittering along the pavement. James Crawford stood just beyond the hotel's entrance, his hands tucked into the pockets of his charcoal suit, his gold cufflinks catching the faint gleam of a nearby street lamp. He gazed out over the city, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the dark sky, the lights twinkling in a rhythmic dance that reflected off the restless waters of Lake Michigan. The lake stretched vast and unyielding, its surface a mirror for the urban glow, a quiet expanse that seemed to swallow the noise of the world above. His breath clouded faintly in the crisp air, his shoulders rising and falling as he took in the scene, the weight of the evening settling into his bones. Across the street, near the curb where valets maneuvered sleek cars into position, Keanu Reeves emerged from the hotel, his black sweater and faded jeans unchanged, his shoulder bag slung casually over one arm. A modest sedan idled nearby, its engine a low purr, and Keanu approached it with the same unhurried stride he'd carried all night. A uniformed attendant stepped forward, gesturing toward a waiting limousine, its polished exterior gleaming under the streetlights. But Keanu waved it off with a slight shake of his head, opting instead for the simpler vehicle. As he opened the car door, a small cluster of onlookers, late-leaving guests or perhaps fans who'd lingered, gathered at a respectful distance, their faces lighting up with quiet excitement. They waved, their hands tentative but eager, and Keanu paused, turning to acknowledge them with a nod and a faint smile, his demeanor warm yet understated. He slipped into the driver's seat, the door closing with a soft thud, and the car pulled away, its taillights fading into the city's nocturnal pulse, leaving behind a trail of admirers who dispersed with contented murmurs. James watched this departure, his hands shifting deeper into his pockets, his posture loosening as the sight stirred something within him. The cold air brushed against his face, sharp and invigorating, and for the first time in hours, perhaps longer, he felt a release, a subtle unburdening that eased the tension he'd carried through the gala. His mind replayed Keanu's presence, the calm at the buffet, the steadiness under scrutiny, the quiet act of stacking chairs, and the words that had lingered between them, words that framed worth not in wealth or display, but in the choices one made, the way one moved through the world. Those thoughts took root, sinking into his consciousness like seeds scattered on fertile ground, their simplicity cutting through the layers of ambition and pride he'd built around himself. He exhaled slowly, the mist of his breath curling upward, and his gaze drifted back to the lake, its dark expanse a canvas for reflection. The evening, which he'd entered with the intent to shine, had morphed into something else. Not a mere embarrassment to shrug off, but a pivot, a moment that demanded he look harder at the man he'd become. His polished shoes scuffed lightly against the pavement as he shifted his weight, his body no longer rigid with the need to impress, his chest lighter than it had been when he'd arrived. He turned from the vista and began walking toward his own car, parked a short distance down the street. Its sleek lines a testament to the success he'd chased for years. Yet as he moved, his steps carried an unfamiliar ease, a rhythm less driven by urgency and more by a quiet resolve. The keys jangled faintly in his hand, the sound crisp in the stillness. And he paused beside the driver's door, glancing back toward the hotel, its facade now a shadow against the night. He knew tomorrow would be different. Not a grand reinvention, but a start, a shift in how he'd measure the days ahead, beginning with the mirror he'd face in the morning. The decision settled over him like the cool air, steadying rather than chilling. And he slid into the car, the engine humming to life as he pulled onto the street. Somewhere in the city's sprawl, Keanu drove on, his modest sedan weaving through the night, a solitary figure whose simplicity and warmth had rippled outward, touching not just James, but every soul who'd crossed his path that evening. The streets stretched before James, lined with the glow of sodium lights and the silhouettes of buildings he'd helped shape. Yet his focus turned inward, the skyline blurring as he carried forward a nascent hope, a trace of something truer than the accolades he'd once sought. The lake glimmered in his periphery, a silent witness to the shift as he navigated into the darkness, the weight of the night transforming into a quiet promise of renewal.